Talk about mutual submission, we're actually talking about something that seems rather explicit in Ephesians 5:21. What's particularly interesting is that mutual submission frames the household codes most clearly in Ephesians. Half of a book that I wrote in 1992 dealt with mutual submission in Ephesians household codes. Sadly, yes, I am over the age of 30 now. And I thought it was a topic on which maybe I could offer some insight. Since that time, a PhD student here at Asbury, Maria Vassar, has defended an excellent dissertation arguing for mutual submission in Colossians, and I've discovered the same pattern while writing a commentary on 1 Peter. Neither of these passages, neither Colossians 3 and 4 nor 1 Peter 2 and 3, are as explicit as Ephesians 5:21 to 6:9. But the collocation of such passages suggests that early Christians were on the more progressive edge of gender relationships in their world. My implied ethical subtext is, of course, so what's wrong with us? But back to my more explicit discussion. Scholars often note that Paul, or on some scholars' view, not mine, but some scholars, pseudo-Paul, adapts the contemporary literary forms of household codes, following even the overall structure in place since the time of the philosopher Aristotle. What's more surprising is the adaptations that Paul makes. Such adaptations include addressing not only the male householder, but also the wife, children, and slaves. Instructions to the husband to love, and the grammatically clear linkage of submission with not only wives, but all believers in 5:21 and 22. Paul also relativizes the slaveholder's authority in 6:5 through 9. Most significantly, Paul frames the household codes with mutual submission in 5:21 and 6:9. Although some other ancient writers, such as Xenophon or Musonius Rufus, were more progressive and interested in mutuality than were others, I know of no other household codes in antiquity that framed their discussion with mutual submission. This raises the questions of why Paul adopts the household code framework to begin with, and why he adapts it in light of Christian teaching stemming from Jesus on servanthood. Similar adaptations appear in Colossians and 1 Peter, suggesting a dynamic in early Christianity that differs from most of its contemporaries. Well, I'll start with Ephesians and spend the most time there. Sometimes Paul gets a bad rap. The slave narratives are replete with sentiments from former slaves in the United States who loved Jesus but hated Paul because slaveholders regularly quoted Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your masters. What the slaveholders didn't bother to quote was the context, which goes on to admonish slaveholders do the same things to them. That is, if slaves have to obey their masters, masters must obey their slaves. Did anyone in the first century take Paul literally on that point? Probably not. But that doesn't change the fact that what he actually said expressed one of the most radically anti-slavery sentiments of his day. He wasn't talking about violently overthrowing the institution. Even the failed slave revolts of his era had never attempted that, and Christians were less than 0.1% of the Roman Empire. But he was talking ethics, and ethics that went beyond mere theory. Some early Stoic philosophers had advocated human equality, but Stoics had backed off from this, and Stoics who could afford it held slaves. Paul and Stoics concurred in principle. Paul affirmed that slaves and slaveholders share the same master in heaven, but Paul's instruction, do the same things to them, goes beyond theory to practice. This isn't an accident, a slip of Paul's tongue or his scribe's pen. Paul frames his entire section of household codes with mutual submission. What are household codes, you ask? In his work on governance, the Greek thinker Aristotle had a large section on family roles. In it, Aristotle instructed the male head of the household how to rule his wife, children, and slaves. Subsequent thinkers adopted the same schema, often in the same sequence, because Rome was suspicious that minority religious groups undermined these traditional values. Such groups often labored to reaffirm their beliefs in such values. Paul presents a series of household codes in the same sequence as Aristotle. The relation of the male head of the household, as it was assumed in his day, to wives, children, and slaves. Paul may be thinking like the member of a minority religious group. After all, he is writing from Roman custody and probably in Rome, Ephesians 3:1, 4:1, and 6:20. Yet Paul changes the standard formula. Instead of addressing just slaveholding men, he also addresses the wives, children, and slaves themselves, who probably comprised a much larger bulk of the church. In Paul's urban congregations, the slaves would have been household slaves, who had more freedom and frequently more opportunities for manumission than other slaves. Nevertheless, they were still slaves. Moreover, he never instructs the male householder to rule, as Aristotle does. Instead, he instructs him how to love his wife, serving her by offering his life for her, 5:25, to avoid provoking his children, 6:4, and to treat slaves as fellow servants of God, 6:9. Most importantly, Paul frames his entire set of instructions in 5:21 through 6:9 by enjoining mutual submission, submitting to one another, 5:21, and doing the same things to them, 6:9. This sets submission in a new context, the example and teaching of our Lord, who invited us all to serve one another in Mark 10:42 to 45, John 13:14 to 17, where he washes his disciples' feet, verses 34 and 35, Galatians 5:13 and 14, and so on. Some patriarchal husbands today quote Ephesians 5:22, "Wives, submit your husbands," out of context, much the way slaveholders quoted Ephesians 6:5 a century and a half ago. But in Greek, there's no verb in 5:22. It simply says, "Wives to your husbands." Of course, Paul isn't saying, "Wives, just do to your husbands whatever you want." Greek grammar presumes that we will carry over the verb from the preceding verse, and that verb is submit. But because the verb is carried over from 5:21, it can't mean something different than what it meant in 5:21. The wife's submission is merely an example of mutual submission. So is the husband sacrificing his life for his wife. Some object, but submission is explicit only for the wife. Yeah, but the command to love is explicit only for the husband, in verse 25. Yet we understand that all Christians should love one another, chapter 5 and verse 2, and that all Christians should submit to one another, in the nearer context, 5:21. Although Paul is not trying to cover every circumstance, he's not talking about submitting when somebody wants you to do something immoral or staying in an abusive situation that you can escape. Paul's not trying to cover every circumstance. He offers us a general principle for how we should live, looking out for one another's interests, listening to one another, loving others more than ourselves. Such advice is in keeping with his explicit teaching elsewhere. For example, in Romans 12:10, 13:8 through 10, 15:2 to 3, 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 to 7, Galatians 5:14, Galatians 6:2, including in Paul's teaching in the preceding context in Ephesians 4:32. What a surprise! This actually fits what Paul teaches elsewhere. When Paul speaks of the husband as the wife's head in 5:23, he addresses this to the wife, not to the husband. He invites the wife to submit, and he goes on to invite the husband to serve her sacrificially. Both are forms of submission or service, and these may be expressed differently in different cultures. For example, I expected that when I got married, my wife and I would share cooking responsibilities. But my wife comes from a culture where she grew up loving to cook. Also, her culinary skills exceed mine, and she won't eat my cooking for some reason. Not sure why when I'm cooking, people sometimes pass by and ask, "Is someone in there sick?" Anyway, apart from certain biological limitations such as nursing, who excels in what is not always transcultural. A few other thinkers in antiquity taught some sort of mutual submission. Like Paul, they were among antiquity's more progressive thinkers. 4 or 5 centuries before Paul, Xenophon argues in Ecumenicus for partnership, koinonia, between spouses. Still, Xenophon does not envision complete complementarity. He contends that nature has suited wives' bodies better for indoor work and husbands for work outdoors. The husband has more courage, he says, but both are equals in memory and self-control. The first-century Stoic thinker Musonius Rufus viewed women as equal to men in nature and in virtues. Although he distinguished their roles, he also often disagreed with the restrictive roles to which his society had limited women. Yet none of these writers thought to frame household codes with explicit mutual submission, including even slaves and slaveholders. More common was the model originally promulgated by Aristotle himself. So, Paul, Musonius Rufus, Xenophon, they're on the more progressive end, but the model originally promulgated by Aristotle himself is a lot closer to the common approach, simply telling the male householder how to rule his household. The male was by nature superior to and ruling over the female, he said. Against Socrates, he doubted the animal analogy in arguing for gender equality. Lower animals, Aristotle insisted, do not have households, requiring careful management. Others appealed to nature to show that males were superior to females. Physical differences were used to justify divergent social treatment. Despite women's considerable progress in Roman society, older Greek ideologies continued to influence elite thinking and writing. On one view, women exist only to make men miserable. That's in Euripides, much earlier writer. A misogynist might wish that women did not exist apart from bearing children. That's a later writer. One example of tactlessness in an earlier writer, Theophrastus, is a guest denouncing women when invited to speak at a wedding. Juvenal, a later writer, Roman writer, longs for the old days of cave women before adultery had been invented, he says. And please forgive me, I'm just repeating what they said. I'm not giving my views, so please do not take a clip out of context. Because of their supposed immaturity, women were often linked with minors, slaves, and the like, not least insofar as Socrates or Thales was said to have praised fortune for not making him a woman, a beast, or a barbarian. Non-Greek for all you who aren't Greek, neither am I. A saying eventually adapted into a Jewish benediction as well. I won't even repeat some of the harsher views about women's character here. And while the Stoic Musonius held friendlier views toward women, not all Stoics agreed. Musonius's predecessor Seneca, a Roman contemporary of Paul, while allowing that women were capable of the same virtues as men, often portrayed women as unstable and irrational, and a later Stoic emperor could regard a man's soul as different from a woman's. In contrast to Epicureans and Pythagoreans, Stoics had few, if any, women pupils. The Stoic egalitarian trend, moving beyond Aristotle's chauvinism, was not meant to disrupt the hierarchical roles already existing in society. Thus, it's said that Roman Stoics were egalitarian in theory, but Aristotelian in practice. And here I'm following David Balch, who's written quite a lot on the household codes. While later rabbis were more diverse and nuanced in their views, some first-century Jewish writers in Greek mirrored classical Athenian prejudices more directly. Philo, a Jewish philosopher in northern Egypt, we could say, in Alexandria, always portrays male as superior to female. He contends that masculinity is closer to divinity than femininity is. When he praises the Empress Livia, he claims that her training made her virtually male in her intellect. Josephus claims that courts should not accept the testimony of women because of their emotional instability. Commenting on the death of a Levite's concubine who was gang raped in Judges 19, Josephus claims that she died from shame, doubting that her husband would forgive her. Josephus believes that men who heed the folly of women merit judgment and cites approvingly the Essene suspicion of women's infidelity. Aside from such ideology, some men were simply brutal. For example, to obey the priests and not be defiled, Sulla divorced his sick and dying wife and had her carried away while she lived. Plutarch reports that when Alcibiades' good wife asked for a divorce, in response to his behavior with courtesans, with prostitutes, or high-class prostitutes, he dragged her home forcibly. She died soon after, while he was away. This was not cruel, Plutarch explains, because the law requires the wife to go to court precisely so that if the husband wants her, he may take her. Abuse was sometimes sanctioned, although especially in earlier times, though even the ancients had their limits. Another man ordered his freedman to beat his 8 months pregnant wife. She died in childbirth, but he was not considered guilty because he grieved and was not deliberately trying to kill her. A man who was found to have killed his wife by throwing her out the window after a struggle did get a death sentence, but there were too many cases where that wasn't the case. Not commenting on death sentences, I guess, but commenting on abuse. Now, turning to Colossians. Paul again is on the more progressive level, although Colossians doesn't go into the same level of detail as Ephesians. Colossians 3:18 to 4:1 also follows the traditional Aristotelian outline, addressing wives, children, and slaves, while emphasizing mutual responsibilities of both. For that matter, 1 Corinthians 7:1 to 5 also emphasizes mutual, and in that case, the same responsibilities of both husbands and wives. The more concise passage in Colossians begins abruptly, more so than its parallel unit in Ephesians. Whereas Ephesians 5:1's functional imperative is really a subordinate participle dependent on the imperative be filled with the Spirit in 5:18. That is, it's describing the results of being filled with the Spirit, at least my understanding of the grammar there. Colossians 3:18 has a genuine imperative, the connection of which to the invitations in 3:16 to 17 is less grammatically explicit. Wives, submit to your husbands. Each of the admonitions in 3:18 to 21 is stated concisely, like simple paranesis, or simple command, simple instruction. They address in immediate succession wives, then husbands, and children, then fathers. The difference in admonitions to wives in 3:18 and to children and slaves in 3:20 and 22 is nevertheless evident in the different choice of verbs. Whereas wives submit, hupatasso, children and slaves obey, hupakuo. It's a stronger expression. Only the slave section is expanded beyond brief comment, but examining that section helps us understand better what Paul is actually doing in this section, because this in turn allows further observation of Paul's intention. As in Ephesians, slaves are called to obey masters, not with the masters themselves in mind, but for Christ, Colossians 3:22 to 25. More stark is the command to masters in Colossians 4:1, which, as in Ephesians 6:9, suggests mutual submission. Most translations say something like, "Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master in heaven." That's the NRSV. But that's because Paul's instructions here, if taken literally, sound too radical for a first century setting. Literally, Paul says grant them justice, ta dikaion, and equality, tein isoteta. Through a thorough lexical search of this language, Marie Vassar has recently shown that isotes normally does mean equality, especially in slavery contexts where it normally contrasts with slavery. That is, Paul's admonition to slaveholders is on the most radical edge of ancient thinkers on the subject. And you say, well, he didn't mean it literally. Well, you have to say that with a number of things in Ephesians and Colossians, a number of adaptations in the household codes, which all tend in one direction. It seems to me that we have to see Paul as among the most progressive thinkers of his day on this subject. 1 Peter. In the context, and I'm doing 1 Peter because I'm just written a commentary on that should be out soon, I think. In the context, in 1 Peter 2:13, Peter explicitly addresses human institutions such as kingship, slavery, and patriarchal marriage structures. Thus, 1 Peter 2:13 and 14, again in the NRSV, "For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right." And 1 Peter 2:18, "Household slaves, submit to masters with all respect." Well, so also wives in 1 Peter 3:1, which he introduces with the Greek term homoios. Likewise, in the same way. And while we're at it, consider 1 Peter 5:5. "Likewise, you who are older, submit to the elders." I should like to point out to you now that I am a really old guy. I am sort of an elder, but maybe not at heart. But 5:5 follows an admonition to the elders not to lord it over the flock, but to be examples to them, treating their overseeing role as a role for service. 5:2. While supporting submission to governing authorities, Peter does not fix for all cultures what such institutions must be or what they must look like. This observation is implicitly recognized by all interpreters today who do not mandate monarchical government, that is, having kings, with all due respect to kings, for those of you who are in societies where you have kings or queens and so on, but we don't mandate that for all cultures, and we certainly don't mandate slavery for all cultures, although some prove inconsistent regarding saying that the authority structures in marriage have to be the same in all cultures. Given cultural expectations, it's not surprising that Peter does not repeat the term for submission, 2:13 and 18 and 3:1 here, that he uses for governing authorities, for slaveholders. But he does speak of showing the wife honor, just as believers must show to rulers and everyone else, 2:17. The husband is not called to submit to his wife in 1 Peter, but he is called to respect his wife, who shares with him the same standing before God as an heir of resurrection life. So it's still moving in a direction that is more explicitly mutual than what we might expect from most of his contemporaries. When he speaks of the husband treating his wife as a weaker vessel, he refers to showing considerateness for the person, I think, in the socially weaker position. So I translate that the more vulnerable member. Keep in mind that Hellenized husbands were often more than a decade their wives' senior. The socially weaker member was in greater need of mercy or attention, just like Paul says for members of Christ's body in 1 Corinthians 12:22. Whatever sphere of weakness is specifically in view, and actually this was applied in a lot of different ways in ancient sources, it appears that part of the point is that the husband should be sensitive to his wife. This would not exclude the wife seeking to protect her husband when necessary and possible, but the assumption was presumably, in that culture, that the wife, being weaker in the sphere in view, has special need for her husband's considerate attention. And of course, none of us is going to complain about doing that today as well, even if we believe that should be mutual. Let's be sensitive to one another. Conclusion. The qualifications of ordinary household codes that appear in Colossians and 1 Peter make all the more likely that Paul did indeed want his hearers to take seriously his framing the Ephesian codes with mutual submission. Indeed, even as late as 1 Clement, more than usual mutuality appears in such discussions, as I suggested in an article back in 1997. Yet applying Paul's teaching on mutual submission literally would have been unheard of in the first century. Just because it was rarely attempted, however, does not make it any less significant. Even today, husbands and wives and people in other kinds of relationships often seek our own interests more than those of others. Paul talks about that in Philippians 2:4 and 2:21. what would happen if we took Paul at his word? And I'm not referring to abusive relationships here, and there's much less mutual submission in the relationship to fathers of minor children. Children do need guidance. But what would happen if we actually begin to put mutual submission into practice? Well, let's try that and find out.